Hello friends and freundins, and welcome to another episode of the Troglodyte channel. In this episode I'm sick, but never mind that. I will still build the Jagdpanzer 38T, also known as Hetzer early production from Takom in 1/35 scale. It is a nicely detailed and very easy to build kit. So come on and let us begin. Naturally, the first thing I had to do was to remove the pieces from the spruce. Then I carefully cleaned any imperfections on the surfaces with my X-Acto knife. And then I gently polished everything with a smooth sandpaper. I started by building the details on the lower hull. I also made the backside and the suspension. I also made the periscope that will be sticking out of the top of the vehicle. This I will have to position before I glue the hull into one piece. And while I was doing that, I realized that my camera had stopped recording. An early casualty in this never-ending battle of modelismus. So instead, here's a quick shot of some woods. This is what I was left with so far. Now it was time to make the tracks. So I carefully removed the road wheels from their spruce. I cleaned them up. And I also carved some marks on them, as they would have from the daily hardships of battle. I put them in place without gluing them, so that I could remove them later. I then proceeded by making some details on the upper hull. And to be honest, I never follow the instructions step by step. I prefer to make all of the small assemblies first and put them together in the end. This is just an easier way of building a model for me. I covered all the periscope's glass with some multi-tack before I put them in place. Later I will paint and weather the model, and then I only have to remove the multi-tack and they will look like glass. Then I again focused on the lower part of the vehicle and I started making the tracks. These Takom tracks are very simple and easy to use, so I didn't have any problems this time. I glued the tracks on the road wheels, but I didn't glue the wheels on the suspensions, if you remember, so that I can remove them whenever I want for easier assembly and painting. Then I started assembling some more of the upper hull and slowly bringing all the big pieces together. But before I'd glue the gun port in place, I wanted to texture it heavily. So I covered it with Mr. Cement Deluxe, I stippled it with the brush, and then I started pinching it with a toothpick. This way, once it gets dry, it will have a nice roughed up texture. I then glued it on the hull, and I stood back to admire my beautiful creation. Then I made the armor plates for the machine gun on top. And I also attached the sides of the hull. I wrapped this nice photo-etched part around the exhaust, and I roughed up the sides with cement glue, just like I did before, so that it will look more corroded or something. This kit includes a few photo-etched parts, and I also added a few of my own, some ready-made and some that I DIY'd myself. I think I find this part of the hobby the most satisfying. Being able to give a model its own character and its own personal history. Here I have an extra wheel to attach on the side of the vehicle, on which I added a tiny chain to hold the safety pin in place, so that the wheel wouldn't fall off. I positioned the gun on the inside and secured it with cement glue. Then I proceeded with making various details around the vehicle. One of the most visible and most important were the side skirts, positioned left and right of the vehicle. So I did some scratches, I poked some holes, and then I manipulated them with the use of a lighter, in order to create dents on the supposed metal. Then I positioned the two front periscopes on a base that would go under the upper hull. But I could not glue it in place yet, because I had some other plans in my mind. Then I added some photo-etched clamps to a couple of tools and the jack. It is relatively simple, but it is a hard procedure, and you do have to be patient. I don't know how much you can tell from these shots right here, but for sure it is something that I do not absolutely enjoy. But what is absolute is the necessity of these parts on a model. I believe the detail they give cannot be compared with any plastic part on a sprue. And of course, the satisfaction in the end. Even if it's not perfect, it still looks better than before. And this is what matters. These plastic handles, for example, that I am applying right here, I should have replaced them with metallic ones. They would have looked much better. I wanted to give some more mass on the sides, so I built two beautiful canisters from AFV Club. One for fuel and one for wasser. And I put them side by side. I mounted them on a storage rack that I made from leftover photo-etched parts. The Hetzer is a small vehicle, after all. They would have to carry their water and oil around somehow. It was time to add some storage accessories. I decided to use a wooden box, a Panzerfaust, a rifle, some MG magazines and a gas mask canister, and a hand grenade. All this wrapped nicely around the tarp. First, I masked off the area where I would work on, so that the tarp wouldn't stick on the plastic surface while it was drying. Then I covered some space with kitchen paper, and I used Tamiya epoxy putty to make the tarp. I've made a few tarps in the past from epoxy putty. I think the more one makes, the better they become at it, because working with putty it's not that easy. It's kind of like sculpturing, and everything must be smooth in the end, and look realistic. But the more you work with it, the better you learn to handle it. By using a toothpick, I slightly bended all of the edges, trying to make it as realistic as possible. And when I would shape it, I would always keep it wet so that it wouldn't get stuck anywhere. Eventually the tarp looked pretty good. But this second one looked even better, and to shape it I didn't use water but baby powder, which seemed to me a much easier way. And it is definitely a technique that I will follow from now on. And now it's time for the trickiest part of them all. I am stripping the vehicle of its gear, because I want to replace the tiny handles on its surface with ones that look more realistic. The ones already in place do not look much like handles. This is normal because they are very small, and I suppose it would be very difficult to be replicated in such a scale. So from the beginning of this build I was planning to replace these handles with real ones made from wire. I removed all of the extra parts of the vehicle that were in the way, and I measured where I wanted the holes with a ruler. I then created a plastic jig 1 mm long to help me to evenly space the holes. Then I marked the holes with an X-Acto knife. After that I drilled into the marks with a 0.4 drill bit. Then I placed the pieces of wire inside the holes, which I have bent already from earlier. And by using the jig and some pressure, I would give them a nice square shape. Afterwards, with the jig placed in the handle, I would bend the wires from the inside, cut the extra length, and glue them in place with superglue. I repeated the procedure all around the vehicle, but my Hetzer would have 4 handles less than the original in total, because I wanted the extra road wheel and the canisters to be placed on these spots. In order to make the holes for the handles, I needed to order a new set of tiny drills, because even the smallest that I have was too big for these holes. So I made the order and I waited a couple of weeks for it to arrive. And this is the main reason for this backwards and forwards build that you see here. Because initially I planned to do these holes way earlier in the video. And that's it. The final part, before gluing the upper to the lower hull, was to position the periscope. But because sometimes I plan ahead and sometimes I don't, I glued one of the hatches closed, and now the gap was too small for the periscope to stick out. So I had to slightly bend the hatch in order to make all of this work. I tried afterwards to glue it back into position, but if you look closely you can see it's still a little bit bent. I could excuse it as another casualty of war. Then the hull came together and became whole, fastened with cement glue. I held the back part with some plastic clamps because it was a little bit flimsy. After I removed the clamps, I observed a few tiny gaps, so I melted the sprue to fill them in. The Takom sprue didn't work that well, but the Tamiya sprue never betrays. I pushed it in between the gap and covered it with cement glue. After a few minutes, I gently tapped it with an X-Acto knife to make the surface smooth. Now it looks much better. So I could proceed with gluing all of the tiny parts on the vehicle. Actually, to be honest, I didn't glue all of them. The bigger parts, the ones that would be hard to paint afterwards, I stuck on the vehicle using multi-tack. For example, I glued the tools on the side, but I did not glue the jack. I just positioned it with multi-tack. This way I can remove it, I can do the paint job and then reposition it. The same with the protective tracks on the front. First they will be painted and then they will be permanently positioned on the vehicle. And here it is. This is the completed model. As you can see, I also added a couple of steel towing cables on the back. Now the only thing left to do is to add a nice camouflage net on the front. So I cut a small piece of bandage and I dipped it into watered down PVA glue. About 60% water, 40% PVA glue, that's my ratio. I kept it in the water for about 10 minutes, Then I took it out, I rinsed it, and I applied it on the vehicle. Then I attempted to shape it as realistic as I could. This means that the net will have to look heavy and obey the laws of gravity. I also poked a few holes with my scissors to make it appear older and torn. Eventually the troglodyte was pretty satisfied with the way the net looks. And with the net done, I think this model is finally complete. And there you have it, friends and freundins. That's the whole vehicle assembled. Unpainted, of course. The troglodyte is satisfied with this one. If you are too, you can like my video and leave a comment. Hey, you could even subscribe. You never know, huh? Thank you so much for watching this episode, and I will see you soon in the next one. Until then, friends and freundins, always remember to